The heavy raindrops rapidly transformed into jagged pieces of hail that mercilessly pounded the roof of the Alpine Retreat diner. The previously clear cerulean sky of a crisp autumn afternoon now displayed an almost nocturnal darkness, occasionally severed by the violent lightning strikes that illuminated the rugged mountains of Estes Park, Colorado. Grace Miller hastily wiped the glistening sweat from her forehead with her forearm, while expertly balancing a large tray carrying 3 steaming mugs of hot chocolate. The fierce storm had arrived without a single warning, catching every resident and tourist completely by surprise. What had initially begun as a gentle, unassuming drizzle had swiftly morphed into a violent, churning torrent, forcing weary highway travelers to desperately seek refuge wherever they possibly could. The small, quaint roadside diner, which was normally quiet and peaceful at that particular hour of the afternoon, was now bursting with anxious people trying to escape the unpredictable fury of nature. "Here are your 3 hot chocolates, Arthur," shouted Grace over the deafening roar of the relentless rain as she carefully handed the heavy tray to a shivering family with a young child who were huddled tightly together at one of the tables situated closest to the window. The older man standing behind the wooden counter offered a grim nod in response, his deeply lined face displaying the exact same heavy concern that Grace was currently feeling in her chest. In his 30 years of managing the Alpine Retreat, Arthur had never witnessed a mountain storm of such sudden and terrifying magnitude. "The main highway leading down to Denver must be completely blocked by now," he commented in a hushed, worried tone when Grace stepped closer to retrieve another round of customer orders. "And the weather forecast predicts it will only get much worse throughout the night." Grace nervously bit her lower lip quietly, processing the grim information as her observant eyes scanned the crowded dining room. All 12 tables were currently occupied, and several more drenched people were standing around awkwardly, constantly checking their smartphones, which displayed absolutely zero cellular signal. She honestly did not need Arthur's spoken confirmation to fully understand that the current situation was incredibly serious. She had only been living in Estes Park for 2 years, but she had already witnessed firsthand how the torrential rains could easily transform the winding mountain roads into deadly traps of slick mud and tumbling rocks. The sharp, sudden jingling of the front doorbell immediately caught her attention. Turning around swiftly, Grace saw an elderly woman standing perfectly still in the entryway, completely and utterly soaked to the bone. Her pure white hair was plastered flat against her pale, fragile face, and her violently trembling hands were clutching a dark leather handbag tightly against her chest. Despite wearing a thick, heavy woolen coat, the poor woman was shivering so visibly that it broke Grace's heart. "Oh my goodness!" Grace gasped as she immediately rushed toward the front door, completely abandoning the damp dish towel she had been holding in her hand. "Please come inside, ma'am. Come sit right over here next to the main radiator." The elderly woman passively allowed Grace to gently guide her toward a small secluded table located right next to the cast-iron wood stove that heated the expansive room. Her hesitant steps were terribly unsteady, as if every single forward movement required a tremendous amount of careful calculation and physical effort. "Thank you so much, my dear," the older woman whispered. Her voice was remarkably soft, but carried an underlying firmness, creating a stark contrast to her incredibly fragile physical appearance. "I was riding in a local taxi when the rain suddenly worsened. The frustrated driver bluntly told me that he could not safely continue down the mountain toward the city, and he simply left me standing out there empty-handedly, promising to return whenever the terrible storm finally passed." Grace frowned deeply, feeling a surge of pure indignation at the driver's callous behavior. Leaving a vulnerable elderly woman entirely alone during a violent mountain storm was simply unforgivable. Grace quickly grabbed a freshly laundered towel from the back supply closet and gently draped it over the shivering woman's shoulders. "Please let me brew a hot pot of tea for you, ma'am. What is your name?" she asked softly. "Amelia. Amelia Morgan," the woman replied graciously, accepting the warm towel with a deeply appreciative smile. As she walked briskly toward the busy kitchen, Grace could not help but notice that Amelia's smartphone looked far too expensive for an average senior citizen, just like the genuine Italian leather handbag she was fiercely protecting. The elegant wedding band on her left hand featured a magnificent diamond that brilliantly reflected the diner's dim lighting like a tiny, radiant sun. They were not the kind of luxurious details that Grace would normally pay any attention to, but something about the older woman's quiet dignity, even while she was drenched and highly vulnerable, profoundly awakened her curiosity. The steaming mug of chamomile tea, generously sprinkled with a dash of cinnamon, exactly the way her late grandmother used to prepare it, finally brought a healthy touch of color back to Amelia's pale cheeks. While the elegant lady slowly sipped the comforting hot beverage, Grace stared out the window at the relentless rain that showed absolutely no signs of stopping. The local news broadcast playing softly on the small television behind the counter gravely confirmed that massive mudslides had entirely blocked off Highway 36, and the authorities strongly recommended that absolutely no one attempt to travel until the following morning. "May I have your attention, everyone?" Arthur's booming voice easily cut through the anxious murmurs of the crowded room, causing the entire diner to fall into an immediate tense silence. "I just received an official update from the local civil defense office. The mountain roads are completely blocked in both directions due to severe mudslides. Nobody will be able to safely leave until the crews clear the debris, which will likely not happen until tomorrow morning. We have some extra thermal blankets in the back, and we will do our absolute best to set up makeshift accommodations right here in the dining room for anyone who needs to spend the night." Panicked murmurs of deep concern rapidly spread across the enclosed space. Several frustrated people were fruitlessly speaking into their dead cell phones, desperately trying to inform their distant families about their unforeseen predicament. "I am so terribly sorry, my dear," Amelia said softly, gently, placing her delicate hand over Grace's hand as the young waitress returned to the table. "It appears that you are going to have a significantly larger workload tonight. Please do not worry about that." Grace smiled warmly, gently squeezing the elderly woman's hand, noting that her skin felt as thin as fragile parchment, but was surprisingly warm. "The only thing that matters right now is that everyone remains safe. Is there anyone you need to contact to let them know where you are?" A brief melancholic shadow crossed Amelia's expressive eyes. "My grandson, Richard. I was actually traveling to visit him at his private cabin down the mountain, but he has no idea that I decided to make the trip today. It was a completely last-minute decision on my part." She clumsily attempted to reach for the expensive smartphone hidden inside her leather bag, but her exhausted hands were trembling far too much to grasp it. "Please, let me assist you with that," Grace immediately offered, gently taking the sleek device that Amelia finally managed to pull out. It was a very modern model equipped with advanced facial recognition technology. Unfortunately, just as they had both suspected, there was absolutely zero cellular or internet signal available. "Do not worry, Amelia. The very second the network comes back online, we will send an urgent text message to your grandson." Grace promised sincerely, carefully, handing the expensive device back to the older woman. "In the meantime, is there anything else you might need? Are you feeling hungry?" Amelia hesitated for a brief moment, clearly not wanting to cause any additional trouble, but she eventually nodded her head in agreement. A small bowl of hot soup would be absolutely wonderful. As she made her way back into the chaotic kitchen to prepare the food, Grace simply could not stop thinking about the mysterious elderly woman. There was a unique, piercing spark of high intelligence and unwavering dignity in her eyes that completely transcended the deep wrinkles lining her face. She strongly reminded Grace of her own beloved grandmother, who had passed away 5 years ago, leaving an incredibly painful void in her chest. The evening hours dragged on at a painstakingly slow pace. Arthur, Grace, and the 2 other dedicated employees, Tyler, the main cook, and Julia, who assisted at the front counter, worked absolutely tirelessly to accommodate all the stranded customers. They creatively improvised sleeping areas by pushing heavy wooden chairs together and carefully distributed the very few available thermal blankets they had in storage. By the time the clock struck 10 o'clock at night, the vast majority of the involuntary guests had already settled down as best as they possibly could, utterly resigned to spending a highly uncomfortable night inside the cold diner. Amelia, however, was looking increasingly pale and profoundly exhausted. Sitting upright in the exact same stiff wooden chair near the cast-iron stove, she would frequently close her eyes attempting to gather her failing strength, only to jolt awake a few minutes later. "You are clearly not feeling well, ma'am," Grace stated softly, gently kneeling right beside the older woman and carefully placing the back of her hand against Amelia's forehead. Thankfully, there was no fever present, but the sheer paleness of her complexion was deeply concerning. "I am just incredibly tired, my sweet girl," Amelia replied, with a very weak, trembling smile. "I am simply not accustomed to partaking in wild mountain adventures like this one." Teachery. Grace quickly surveyed the crowded room. The entire diner was packed to the brim, excessively noisy, and despite all their best collective efforts, severely uncomfortable. A fragile woman of Amelia's advanced age desperately needed a real, comfortable bed and absolute silence in order to rest properly. Grace quietly made a firm decision that she knew might slightly complicate her own life, but her empathetic heart simply would not allow her to ignore the situation. "Amelia, I actually live in a very small private apartment attached directly to the back of this diner. It is certainly not luxurious by any means, but it does have a very comfortable bed, and it is perfectly quiet. You are more than welcome to spend the night back there." The elderly woman's eyes widened slightly, clearly surprised by the incredibly generous offer. "But what about you, my dear young lady? Where on earth will you sleep?" "I have a perfectly fine sofa in my living room that will serve me just well." Grace smiled warmly, already standing up. "I absolutely will not take no for an answer. Please come with me. I will help you get properly settled." After having a very brief, hushed conversation with Arthur, who immediately and fully agreed with the sensible arrangement, Grace carefully led Amelia through the bustling kitchen and into the modest back apartment where she lived. It was a remarkably simple but deeply welcoming space. There was a modest living area featuring a small 2-seater sofa, a tall wooden bookshelf overflowing with classic novels, a compact kitchen with a neat dining counter, a reasonably sized bedroom, and a single bathroom. It was nothing fancy, but it was impeccably clean and perfectly organized. "This is an absolutely lovely home," Amelia commented softly, carefully observing the beautifully framed photographs hanging on the walls. "It strongly reminds me of the very first house I lived in right after I got married." While Grace was busy preparing the cozy bedroom for her entirely unexpected guest, she managed to find a freshly washed flannel nightgown and gently offered it to the older woman. "This should fit you well. It is certainly not new, but it is perfectly clean and very warm." Amelia graciously accepted the folded garment with a deeply grateful smile. "You know, throughout my 78 years of life, I have learned that there is a massive difference between basic politeness and genuine, heartfelt kindness," she said softly, gently, holding both of Grace's hands between her own. "What you are doing for me tonight is not just basic customer service or professional obligation. It is an act of pure, unadulterated goodness. And that specific quality, my dear, is becoming increasingly rare in our modern world. Grace immediately felt a wonderful, comforting warmth spread rapidly throughout her entire chest. During the 2 years she had been working diligently at the Alpine retreat, ever since she had relocated from Boulder, following her beloved grandmother's tragic death, she had slowly developed a tough outer shell of strict professional efficiency. She always performed her daily tasks exceptionally well and was flawlessly polite to every customer, but she very rarely allowed herself to form any deep, meaningful emotional connections. Something about Amelia, however, had effortlessly managed to pierce right through that heavy defensive barrier without seemingly trying at all. "Please, just rest well tonight, Amelia," she replied softly, gently, squeezing the elderly woman's frail hands. "Tomorrow morning, as soon as this terrible storm finally passes, we will make sure to help you contact your grandson." The crisp morning eventually brought a very timid pale light that slowly filtered through the narrow gaps in the window blinds. Grace groggily woke up with a terribly stiff neck, which was the unfortunate consequence of spending the entire night curled up on a sofa that was simply too small for her body. She stretched her aching limbs incredibly slowly, blinking her heavy eyes as she tried to orient herself in the quiet space. For a brief, confusing moment, she did not even recognize her own living room until the dramatic events of the previous night suddenly came rushing back to her memory. She silently stood up from the sofa and quietly tiptoed over to the bedroom door, which had been left slightly ajar. Amelia was currently sleeping incredibly deeply, her chest rising and falling in a perfectly steady rhythmic motion beneath the thick quilt. Grace smiled widely, feeling immensely relieved to see that the fragile older woman had finally managed to get some proper healing rest. Moving quietly into the small adjoining kitchen, she carefully brewed a fresh pot of dark roast coffee, allowing the rich, comforting aroma to completely fill the tiny apartment. She knew she desperately needed to return to the diner to assist Arthur with the remaining stranded guests, but she simply did not want to leave before Amelia woke up. A quick glance out the kitchen window wonderfully confirmed that the violent rain had finally ceased, although the morning sky was still heavily burdened with thick, dark gray clouds. "Good morning, my sweet girl," a soft voice suddenly called out. Grace turned around, pleasantly surprised. Amelia was standing gracefully in the kitchen doorway, wearing the borrowed flannel nightgown and looking remarkably refreshed. "Good morning to you, Amelia. Did you manage to sleep well?" Grace asked warmly, politely pulling out a wooden chair so the older woman could sit down at the tiny dining table. "I honestly slept better than I have in several years," Amelia replied with a truly radiant smile. "That mattress of yours is significantly more comfortable than it initially appears to be." Grace happily poured 2 large mugs of steaming coffee, adding a large plate of toasted bread and a jar of homemade strawberry jam that she had carefully prepared several weeks prior using fresh fruit purchased from the local farmer's market. "I actually made this jam myself," she casually commented, while Amelia generously spread a thick layer of the bright red preserve over her crisp toast. "Oh my goodness, this is absolutely divine!" the elderly lady exclaimed momentarily, closing her eyes in pure culinary appreciation. "My own mother used to make a strawberry preserve very similar to this one, although she always liked to add a tiny pinch of fresh cinnamon to her secret recipe." "My grandmother did the exact same thing," Grace said, sitting down, quickly, genuinely excited by the lovely coincidence. "It was actually my Grandma Clara who patiently taught me how to make all sorts of preserves and jams. She always told me that the ultimate secret was to carefully pick the fresh berries at the absolute peak of their natural ripeness." The delightful conversation flowed incredibly naturally between the 2 women as they enjoyed their simple morning meal. Amelia fondly shared stories about her late husband, Albert. "And what about you, my dear young lady?" How exactly did you end up living in this remote, quiet corner of the Colorado mountains? Amelia asked, with that specific kind of genuine, piercing interest that made Grace feel truly seen and understood. I actually moved up here to Estes Park about 2 years ago, right after my grandmother passed away. She was the one who lovingly raised me from the time I was 5 years old, ever since I tragically lost both of my parents in a terrible car accident. Grace suddenly realized that she was freely sharing far more personal details than she normally ever would with a complete stranger. But something about Amelia's calm maternal presence naturally inspired a deep sense of absolute trust. I was actually studying English literature at the university in Boulder, but after Grandma Clara died, our old house just felt entirely too empty. "And what about your university degree?" Amelia asked, her sharp eyes highly attentive. Grace shifted slightly in her wooden chair, feeling a sudden wave of deep discomfort. "I formally withdrew from all my classes. The original plan was to take a short break and eventually go back." She gently shrugged her shoulders. "But I suppose life just happens. You have to work. You have to pay the daily bills. And eventually the mundane routine just takes over everything." Amelia nodded slowly, offering absolutely zero judgment in her gentle expression. After a long moment of contemplative silence, the older woman softly recited a famous line from a classic Robert Frost poem, reminding Grace that sometimes the unexpected diverging roads we encounter are not there to stop us, but rather to force us to discover much better paths. Before Grace could even formulate a proper response, 3 loud, firm knocks on her apartment door abruptly interrupted their conversation. Grace deeply furrowed her brow, wondering exactly who could possibly be knocking on her private door so early in the morning. She logically assumed it must be Arthur, desperately needing her immediate assistance back in the chaotic diner. "Please give me just one moment," she politely asked Amelia, quickly standing up from the small dining table. As she pulled the wooden door open, Grace completely froze in her tracks. Standing directly in front of her was an incredibly tall, strikingly handsome man with sharp, angular facial features that perfectly combined a sense of intense seriousness with deep underlying worry. He was dressed impeccably in dark tailored trousers and a crisp light blue button-down shirt, the sleeves of which were casually rolled up to his strong elbows. "Good morning to you. I am urgently looking for Amelia Morgan," the tall man stated firmly. His deep, resonant voice was highly controlled, although Grace could easily detect a strong current of frantic anxiety hiding just beneath his flawlessly polite tone. "I was just informed by the manager inside the restaurant that she might possibly be in here." Before Grace could even open her mouth to offer a proper reply, she heard Amelia's joyful voice calling out from behind her. "Richard, how on earth did you manage to find me all the way up here?" The handsome man. Richard looked instantly and profoundly relieved. His broad shoulders visibly relaxed, and the harsh, worried expression on his face completely softened into pure affection. "Grandma, for the love of heaven, I have been frantically trying to call your cell phone for the past 14 hours, he loudly exclaimed confidently, stepping right into the small apartment after receiving a quick, silent nod of permission from Grace. "When I saw the devastating local news reports regarding the massive mudslides on the mountain highway, I was absolutely beside myself with worry. Your housekeeper finally told me that you had left the city, claiming you were coming up to visit my cabin." Richard gently enveloped his grandmother in a tight, protective embrace, acting as if he were terribly afraid that she might suddenly break into a million pieces. Amelia happily returned the warm hug with a surprising amount of physical strength. "I merely wanted to surprise you," she softly explained. "Why wouldn't you just call to tell me you were coming up the mountain?" Richard sighed deeply, clearly highly familiar with his grandmother's legendary stubbornness. "At least you are perfectly safe," he finally said, looking around the small room and seemingly noticing the highly modest environment for the very first time. His intense brown eyes eventually returned to focus on Grace, who was currently standing awkwardly near the front door, feeling completely and utterly out of place inside her own home. "Please forgive my terribly rude intrusion. I am Richard Morgan." He formally introduced himself, politely extending his large right hand toward her. "From what I have just gathered, you are the incredibly kind person who took my grandmother in during the terrible storm." Grace cautiously accepted his extended hand instantly, noting the slight unexpected calluses on his palm, which strongly suggested that despite his polished corporate appearance, this man was certainly no stranger to hard physical labor. "I am Grace Miller. I work as a waitress over at the diner. Your grandmother arrived late yesterday afternoon completely soaked by the freezing rain. Since the main dining room was completely packed with stranded tourists, I simply offered her my private apartment, so she could actually get some proper rest." Richard's facial expression shifted subtly, displaying a complex mixture of genuine surprise and immense gratitude. "I am profoundly grateful for your incredible kindness, Miss Miller," he stated quietly, the formal tone of his deep voice sharply contrasting with the intense, penetrating way he was looking at her. "It was honestly nothing special." Grace quickly replied, feeling strangely self-conscious under his unwavering gaze. Her eyes nervously darted toward the small clock hanging on the kitchen wall. "Oh my, it is already past 9 o'clock. I really need to get back out there and help in the diner. I imagine that many of our stranded customers are incredibly anxious to finally hit the road now that the storm has passed. Of course, we certainly do not want to delay your important work," Richard said very quickly. "Grandma, shall we go ahead and gather your belongings? We urgently need to head back down to Denver. Your private doctor called the house twice yesterday, terribly worried because you completely missed your scheduled appointment." "That silly doctor worries far too much about absolutely nothing," Amelia grumbled softly, although there was no real irritation in her voice. "Grace, my dear, where exactly did I place my handbag?" While Grace kindly assisted Amelia in gathering her few personal items, she noticed Richard quietly observing the various framed photographs hanging on the living room wall, paying particular attention to one specific picture where Grace was smiling brightly next to her late grandmother. There was something highly specific in his expression, a deeply contained genuine curiosity that caused Grace's heart to inexplicably beat a little faster. After Amelia finished changing her clothes, she noticed her heavy coat was still damp. Grace quickly offered to have it professionally dry cleaned in town and ship it down to Denver, firmly refusing Richard's casual offer to simply buy a brand new one. This specific coat holds immense sentimental value. Amelia scolded her grandson gently. She quickly wrote down her personal contact information on a piece of heavy, expensive stationery and handed it to Grace. "Please call me the very moment this coat is ready, my dear. I absolutely insist." The three of them slowly walked back through the busy diner and out into the crowded parking lot. A massive black luxury SUV was parked near the entrance, with a neatly dressed driver named George waiting patiently outside. Richard helped his grandmother into the comfortable back seat, then turned back to face Grace. He politely thanked her once again, and as they briefly shook hands, he discreetly pressed a thick, customized business card directly into her palm. Grace looked down and saw his name printed elegantly with a private cell phone number handwritten clearly in blue ink right below it. Exactly 3 days had passed since Amelia and her handsome grandson had left the mountain town. The devastating storm had undoubtedly left a massive trail of destruction across the winding mountain roads, but the daily routine at the Alpine Retreat Diner was gradually returning to normal. Grace stood in her apartment, carefully folding Amelia's expensive woolen coat, which was now completely dry and impeccably clean after a highly specialized treatment she had personally paid for at the best laundry service in Estes Park. The incredibly fine fabric now exuded a very faint, pleasant aroma of fresh lavender. "You still haven't called that sweet old lady, have you?" Tyler asked loudly, casually leaning against the wooden frame of the back door while he watched Grace meticulously wrap the heavy coat in delicate tissue paper. "How exactly do you know that?" Grace quickly retorted, deliberately avoiding her childhood friend's knowing gaze. Tyler laughed out loud, stepping right into the small apartment without any formal invitation and casually dropping himself onto the small sofa. "Because I have known you since we were 10 years old, Grace, and because I have literally watched you stare blankly at that fancy business card at least 15 different times over the past 3 days. You always have that exact same terrified expression on your face, like you are standing on the edge of a massive cliff preparing to jump." Grace squeezed her eyes shut for a brief moment, feeling her cheeks flush with heat. Tyler was absolutely right. Richard's card was currently sitting inside her nightstand drawer like a dangerous secret. "It is really not that simple, Tyler," she muttered quietly, carefully tying a neat string around the wrapped package. "And exactly why not?" Tyler dramatically raised a skeptical eyebrow. "The nice lady explicitly asked you to call her the very minute the coat was fully ready." "I know it is ready, but—" Grace sighed deeply, finally sitting down right next to her friend. "Did you see the luxury car they drove away in? Did you see the incredibly expensive clothes they were wearing? They are incredibly wealthy, Tyler." Tyler simply shrugged his broad shoulders without any hesitation. "So what? The grandmother clearly adored you, and her grandson definitely liked you too, judging by the intense way he was staring at you the entire time he was here." Grace frantically shook her head desperately, trying to banish the vivid, fluttery images that Tyler's blunt words immediately evoked in her mind. It was technically true that Richard had looked at her quite intensely on a few occasions, but that absolutely did not mean anything romantic. "You are just imagining things that do not actually exist," she finally said, standing up abruptly. "Regardless, I am going to call Amelia this afternoon. I gave her my word that I would safely return her coat, and I am going to keep my promise." After the chaotic lunch rush finally ended, Grace sat down alone on the quiet back porch. Her stomach was tied tightly in nervous knots as she slowly dialed the Denver phone number printed on the elegant card. After only 3 short rings, a highly professional female voice answered the line. "Morgan Residence, Hannah speaking." "Oh, good afternoon," Grace stammered slightly, caught entirely off guard by the formal greeting. "I would very much like to speak with Amelia Morgan, please. This is Grace from the diner up in Estes Park." There was a very brief pause followed by a warm reply. "One moment, please, Miss Miller." Grace blinked in pure surprise at being instantly recognized by her last name. Before she could ponder the implications of that detail, Amelia's joyful voice rang through the phone. "Grace, my sweet dear, what an absolute joy it is to finally hear your lovely voice today. How are you feeling, Amelia? Have you fully recovered from your wild mountain adventure?" Grace asked naturally, smiling at the sound of the older woman's genuine happiness. "I am doing perfectly well, entirely. Thanks to your wonderful care." Amelia laughed softly. "I assume you are calling to tell me about the coat." "Yes, it is perfectly clean and dry now. I can easily ship it down to you via overnight mail if you would prefer." "Absolutely not." The firm response came back instantly. "You simply must bring it down here to Denver in person. I absolutely insist that you come over and have a proper afternoon tea with me. How about this coming Saturday?" The sudden generous invitation caught Grace completely unprepared. "I am honestly not sure if I can—" Grace hesitated, her frantic mind desperately searching for a polite, believable excuse. "Oh, please come, Grace. Do not deny an old woman this simple pleasure." Amelia continued, her tone shifting to something much softer and incredibly persuasive. "I very rarely meet young people with whom I can converse as easily and deeply as I did with you. Furthermore, I really want to show you my private collection of rare poetry books. I have several glorious first editions that I know you would truly appreciate." The strategic mention of rare literature successfully struck a very sensitive, passionate chord deep within Grace's heart. "Well, Saturday is my only day off from the diner," she finally conceded. "Excellent." Amelia's deep satisfaction was incredibly palpable through the phone line. "I will have George drive the car up to the mountains to personally pick you up right around 2 o'clock in the afternoon." "A private car?" "No, that is really not necessary," Grace immediately protested. "I can easily take the regional bus down to the city." "Do not be entirely absurd, my dear," Amelia interrupted with a tone that absolutely forbade any further argument. "The bus system is terribly unreliable. George will be there at 2 o'clock sharp. And please do not worry about wearing anything formal. This will just be a casual afternoon tea between two good friends." When Grace finally hung up the phone, she felt incredibly dizzy, as if she had just been swept away by a gentle but utterly unstoppable river current. Saturday somehow arrived much faster than Grace had originally anticipated. After tossing and turning throughout a highly restless night, she woke up exceptionally early and stared blankly into her open closet with a rapidly growing sense of sheer panic. Absolutely nothing she owned seemed remotely appropriate for visiting a massive luxury penthouse owned by someone like Amelia Morgan. Her faded blue jeans, her simple cotton blouses, and her two plain casual dresses all felt terribly inadequate for the occasion. She eventually selected a modest navy blue dress with three-quarter sleeves that she usually reserved for special family occasions, pairing it with sensible beige flats and a delicate silver necklace that had originally belonged to her beloved grandmother Clara. It was honestly the very best she could possibly do. Exactly. At 2 o'clock, the gleaming black luxury SUV smoothly pulled up right in front of the rustic diner. George, the professional driver, stepped out of the vehicle and immediately approached her with a highly respectful posture and a very kind, welcoming smile. "Good afternoon, Miss Miller. Are you completely ready to depart?" Grace nodded silently, painfully aware of the highly curious stares coming from everyone inside the diner. Arthur was watching closely from the large front window, his wrinkled face displaying a funny mixture of paternal pride and deep concern. Tyler, on the other hand, was grinning widely from ear to ear, giving her a very enthusiastic double thumbs-up signal from behind the counter. The long drive down the winding mountain roads and into the bustling city of Denver was by far the most comfortable travel experience Grace had ever had in her entire life. The heavy vehicle glided almost silently over the pavement. The climate control kept the interior at an absolutely perfect temperature, and the soft classical music playing through the premium speakers created an incredibly relaxing, almost surreal atmosphere. George spoke only when Grace actively initiated the conversation, but he proved to be surprisingly knowledgeable about classic literature. After roughly 2 hours of smooth driving, they finally entered the highly affluent neighborhood of Cherry Creek. Grace desperately tried to hide her absolute astonishment when the large vehicle pulled up in front of a magnificent classical-style residential building. "Mrs. Morgan is eagerly expecting you upstairs, Miss," George politely informed her, gently guiding her past the marble lobby and directly into a private brass-paneled elevator. As the quiet elevator rapidly ascended toward the top floor, Grace's stomach twisted into nervous knots. The heavy oak doors slid open directly into the magnificent penthouse. Amelia, looking absolutely radiant, in an elegant emerald green silk blouse and matching trousers, immediately opened her arms wide in a warm, familiar gesture of genuine welcome. "Grace, my dear, it is so incredibly wonderful to see you again," she joyfully exclaimed, pulling the younger woman into a tight, affectionate embrace. "Please come right in. The hot tea is almost entirely ready for us." The massive apartment was exactly as Grace had imagined it would be, yet simultaneously entirely different. It undeniably possessed the expected high-end luxury, gleaming hardwood floors, magnificent original oil paintings hanging on the walls, and authentic Persian rugs, but it also radiated a very cozy, lived-in warmth. There were tall stacks of hardback books resting on various side tables, numerous framed family photographs displayed on a grand piano, and colorful, embroidered throw pillows scattered across the plush velvet sofas. "This is an absolutely beautiful home," Grace commented with total honesty as she slowly followed her gracious host toward a massive living room that featured large glass doors opening onto an expansive outdoor balcony with a stunning view of the distant Rocky Mountains. Grace gently handed over the carefully wrapped package containing the dry-cleaned coat. Amelia accepted it with a grateful smile, simply placing it aside without even opening it. "Thank you so much, my dear. Now please come out to the balcony. The afternoon tea will be served out there." As Grace followed the older woman outside, she could not help but notice that the massive apartment seemed entirely empty of any other family members. There was absolutely no sign of Richard anywhere, which caused Grace to feel a very tiny, inexplicable pang of sudden disappointment, followed instantly by intense frustration with herself. She firmly reminded herself that she was absolutely not here to see Richard. She was merely here to return a coat and enjoy a polite conversation. Amelia warmly welcomed Grace to an elegant afternoon tea on her balcony, where their conversation about literature quickly revealed a deep intellectual connection. She later guided Grace through her magnificent private library, explaining that books held value because of the ideas and emotions they contained, rather than their price. Amelia praised Grace's kindness and appreciation for genuine worth, then casually revealed that her grandson Richard might stop by, making Grace suspect the meeting had been carefully arranged. Richard's arrival confirmed Amelia's subtle matchmaking plans, and after some light-hearted embarrassment, he invited Grace to explore the rooftop garden. As they spent time together, they shared personal stories of family loss, abandoned academic dreams, and unexpected responsibilities, discovering a strong emotional bond despite their vastly different backgrounds. Their friendship soon developed into romance, strengthened by honest conversations, mutual understanding, and the realization that wealth and status mattered far less than character and compassion. Their relationship continued to grow through thoughtful dates and meaningful moments, including a quiet mountain picnic, where Richard confessed that Grace's selfless care for his grandmother had changed his outlook on life. As they shared their first kiss beneath the stars, Grace understood that life's unexpected hardships often lead to extraordinary opportunities. Her simple act of generosity during a storm had connected two very different worlds, proving that kindness, sincerity, and an open heart can create life-changing relationships and a future richer than material success.